Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of ConnectNext. If you're joining us for the first time, ConnectNext is First Line Technology's virtual informational series where we talk about new developments and topics in the fields of hazardous materials, mass casualty response, and personal cooling. Today's episode is a little bit different because we're going to be talking about technology that was originally developed for the military, but has now found use in athletic programs, in the workplace, and in other areas to not only prevent, but also to treat heat stress. But this new use that we're looking at is the ability to increase athletic performance by using this system. So Jason, can you tell us a little bit about the ICE system today?
Sure, thanks Corey. The Immersion cooling equipment, or ICE system, was developed by the Army to prevent heat stress. It is a lightweight, portable, and durable unit designed for forearm cooling to prevent heat stress and cold water immersion to treat heat injury. Today we are joined by Dr. Douglas Casa and Michael Szymanski from the Korey Institute at University of Connecticut. Dr. Casa and his team have recently wrapped up some exciting research on the ICE system and its potential to increase athletic performance. Dr. Casa, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, it's an honor today to join you for this presentation. I'm super excited to have this opportunity to talk about heat safety for laborers. My name is Dr. Casa. I work at the Korey Institute at the University of Connecticut, where some of our main focus areas is maximizing safety and performance for the physically active, and we really target the athletes, warfighters, and laborers. For a sense of disclosure, these 9 entities listed here are our corporate partners at the Korey Institute. We work closely with the entities listed here to further our mission to protect athletes, warfighters, and laborers, and we're very thankful for their support. I got interested in this area of athlete safety and warfighter safety and laborer safety because of something that happened to me when I was 16 years old. When I was a senior, about to start my senior year in high school, I was running in something called the Empire State Games. The Empire State Games is an Olympic-style sports festival held in New York State every summer, and it had for a really long time. And it was kind of a huge accomplishment to try to make the Empire State Games. And it was a dream of mine since 8th grade to try to qualify for Empire State Games. And the Long Island region is a big region, maybe 100 high schools, and they only take the top 2 in each track event. So I tried out after 8th grade, after 9th grade, after 10th grade, never made it. My last chance to try out was this time after 11th grade. And I ultimately made the team, and I had qualified in June of 1985. Tied for first place with another individual in the 10K race, which is a 25-lap race on the track. The finals with a whole New York State competing was on August 8th, 1985. And they had the wisdom to run that race, the 10K race, at noontime on the track during a heat wave. And I have to tell you that the 100 and 200 meter races that last 10 and 20 seconds were running at night under the lights. So no risk of heat stroke. The short events were under the lights at night, and the 25-lap race that's 30 minutes long was being run in the middle of the day with full sun. So I ran that race, was running the race of my life, was contending for a medal on the last lap, and with 200 meters to go, I collapsed, got back up again, and collapsed with 50 meters to go after running 24 3/4 laps. And I ended up waking up about 6 hours later, having suffered an exertional heat stroke. I was in a coma for the afternoon. So that's kind of the beginning of my story that got me interested in what we can do to possibly prevent and keep athletes safe. But I want to put it in context. So the person you see sitting with me on the slide here is Kent Scriber. He is the athletic trainer, the licensed medical professional who was working the track and field at the Empire State Games that day at SUNY Buffalo. And he knew right away it was an exertional heat stroke, and it started caring for me immediately and cooling me aggressively, and got me in an ambulance that was actually on site right away and got me to the hospital, where I was also super fortunate that the emergency room physician had worked previously in the military and was very aware of how to treat heat stroke. And in 1985, I was placed in an ice tub in a hospital, which is unheard of and still doesn't really happen in most hospitals today. But to give you an idea of how long ago this is, Carl Lewis was like my hero. This was 1985. He had just won 4 gold medals in 1984. Bo Jackson was my other hero. These are the athletes of the 80s that I followed, obviously dating myself a little bit, but these were my heroes. This is the context of how long ago this was. This is over 35 years ago. Alberto Salazar and Joan Punoy were my running heroes, New York City Marathon winners and Olympic champions. So this is how long ago my story started. This is the actual letter congratulating me that I made the Empire State Games, and it meant so much to me because I had tried for 4 straight years, and it was a big deal to be the qualifier from Long Island. This was the number I had on the day I collapsed and had my heat stroke. Newsday and New York Times and other newspaper outlets had articles about the heat strokes that took place. This is one from Newsday talking about my collapse that particular day. So I want to carry my story forward a little bit. That was 1985, and in 2001, I was giving a presentation for an award I had won at the NATA meeting in Los Angeles. And super interesting, it's the first time I ever publicly spoke about my heat stroke. So the story I'm telling you right now, this is the first time I ever shared that story at this presentation. I just felt like it was time to share my story. And in the audience was a person who had previously been a student at Ithaca College. And that's where Ken Scriber worked. His full-time job as an athletic trainer. And so super fascinating story is this lady named Cindy, she heard the story and heard me tell my heat stroke story. And it was the same story she had heard at Ithaca College when heat stroke was covered in her class. And so it was in June of 2001, I found out who saved my life. That's how I found out that Ken Scriber was the athletic trainer who saved my life. She connected us because Ken had no idea who he saved that day. It was just some high school runner from Long Island. And little did he know that the person he saved went on to obviously study heat stroke and obviously, publish in this area and try to enhance health and safety policies in this area. So I think it was pretty exciting for him to see that the person he saved has made a lifetime mission of this particular work. So that was June of 2001. And then tragically, Korey Stringer passed away on August 1st of 2001, having suffered an exertional heat stroke at a Minnesota Vikings practice. On a brutally hot couple days in a row where it was over 100 degrees and they didn't modify practices at all, did a typical 2-a-day on a Monday. He had a heat stroke on Tuesday morning. They were in full gear both days. Unfortunately, he was hypothermic for an extended period of time because they did not use aggressive cooling, and he passed away about 14 hours later from the complications from that heat stroke. And that was 2001. And, I mentioned my story with Ken Scriber and the person that saved my life. But that story, obviously, Korey Stringer passing away in 2001, and I assisted his widow, his agent, for the next 9 years during all the legal pursuits that took place. And it was in in April of 2010 that we founded the Korey Stringer Institute. We started with 3 employees. We now have over 80 between staff and volunteers, and grown to manage many Department of Defense grants and a lot of public health initiatives to try to enhance safety. So that's kind of just the backstory of how we got from 1985, to 2001 to 2010 when Korey Stringer Institute was founded until today when we're speaking with you. We've had good fortune to, work with First Line already with doing some research studies, which Mike will share with you after my talk. I want to kind of give you a little bit of an overview and backstory on heat illnesses. Some of the heat illnesses you're familiar with, like heat syncope, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. We're going to talk about those. We're going to spend a little bit more time on heat stroke. We're going to talk a little bit more of a focus on some of the things in the laborer setting, because that's a kind of a big new initiative with us, at the Korey Stringer Institute. So heat syncope, you've heard the term before, but it's basically when someone has been in the heat, usually dehydrated, and has these signs and symptoms that are listed here that I'm not going to repeat right now, but people then get lightheaded or they faint. And the treatment is relatively simple, laying someone down, propping their legs above their level of their heart, rehydrating them, cooling them down if they're warm, and things like that. So this is a pretty common heat illness, more common when people are not used to being in the heat, also more common when people's posture suddenly changes. So for instance, if you're in the heat but sitting for a long time and then suddenly stand, you might get lightheaded. Or if you've been standing for an extended period of time and then you suddenly sit or stop, then some people can become lightheaded. So this is a pretty common, especially with laborers exercising in the heat, but as well with warfighters and laborers and athletes. Heat cramps, second one I had listed before. Some people use the term exercise-associated muscle cramping, which might be the more kind of appropriate term. Heat cramps is probably more the term that people are used to in a lot of the different settings. These cramps largely are from probably, doing unique novel activity, really exhausting activity that people are not used to. I do believe that they're probably more likely in the heat when people are dehydrated and have electrolyte deficiencies, but it's largely, I think, due to extreme fatigue. But obviously, when you're in the heat, the fatigue happens faster. So I think that that's just one of the reasons we see these cramps more likely in the heat. But again, it's not a super serious condition, but it could prevent someone from being productive at work, and obviously compromise their workday and cause other people to stop to care for them. Heat exhaustion, a little more serious of a heat illness. It's inability to continue exercise in the heat. Largely happens when people are not heat acclimatized or not used to that exercise in the heat. Probably one of the more common heat-related issues. You can see some of the signs and symptoms here, especially extreme fatigue, weakness, vomiting, dizziness, things like that. They need rest, they need shade. Usually put their feet above the level of their heart, cool them with ice wet towels over their whole body, or other shade and ice bags or ice on the body, or air conditioning, anything that could create a better microenvironment, take them out of the heat, things like that. So these are some of the things to consider. Exertional heat stroke is obviously the most important heat illness that we're talking about today. This is the one that could cause someone to die. This is often people think of someone, this is as a failure of the thermoregulatory system, and it's not. It's an overwhelming of the thermoregulatory system. You're simply generating more heat in a given period of time than you're able to dissipate or lose. So slowly over time, your body temperature creeps up, and if it gets to dangerous levels like above 105 and stays there for an extended period of time, that could become extremely dangerous for an individual. So that's something we need to consider. So there's a lot of things when we think about heat stroke we need to consider. First of all, what can we do to prevent it in the first place? What can we do to recognize it quickly if it does present itself? And then what can we do to treat it if we're then assured that we're dealing with a heat stroke? So I'll talk about some of those things today. But first of all, the things you can do to prevent it, there's probably four biggest strategies. Is one, keeping your workers or athletes or soldiers hydrated. Second is making sure they're heat acclimatized. So that's the gradual transformation of the physiological changes that happen during the first couple of weeks of exercise in the heat. So protecting people, especially during that first week of heat exposure. Third is modifying the work to rest ratio based on the environmental conditions. So if it's hotter out, you have more rest breaks that are longer to allow more time for the body temperature to cool down and more time for them to rehydrate. And fourth is education, making sure supervisors understand how these things need to be implemented, and how the employees or the athletes themselves or the soldiers themselves, things that they can do to protect themselves, and kind of keep an eye out for themselves and their fellow workers or teammates. And then if someone does present with something that you think is heat stroke, obviously quickly recognizing it. So there would be things like CNS dysfunction, mental compromise, confusion, combativeness, being just kind of out of it, not responding to questions, or just being completely unconscious. And then obviously the treatment is getting someone's body temperature down as fast as humanly possible. So if you see that CNS dysfunction and you have a extremely high body temperature, if there's a medical person on site who could get a rectal temperature, if you see those two things, trying to cool someone down as fast as possible. There's a hyperlink on the screen right here that is a really high-end video that the KSI did with the NFL to create a heat stroke video. It's about 12 minutes long, but really does a good overview of the prevention, recognition, and treatment of heat stroke. And I'd highly recommend consider using that in your educational platform wherever you are, to see the basics related to heat stroke. So when we're talking about the signs and symptoms of heat stroke, you'll notice there's two things in red. Those are the two things that really differentiate it from heat exhaustion and really from other medical conditions. Because a lot of the other signs and symptoms you see here could be part of other medical conditions. You could have vomiting with hyponatremia. You could have it with heat exhaustion. You could even have it with a head injury. You could have, so a lot of these things here could present for other reasons. But extreme hypothermia at the time of collapse and altered consciousness, there's a really good chance you're dealing with an exertional heat stroke. So showing about the timing of treatment of a heat stroke is very important, and I want people to understand. Your goal is to get someone's temperature down under 104 within 0 to 30-minute window. So that's when we've traditionally seen, at least with the evidence we've been able to see so far, survival without complications. If it's more than 30 minutes, but maybe like 30 to 60 minutes, it might have long-term complications. And then maybe if it's over an hour or longer, it could be permanent complications. It could still certainly be death as well in that time zone I just mentioned, but and then obviously the longer time frame, more likely the person's going to die. So this just gives you an idea. Ultimately, our goal is to get their temperature down as fast as humanly possible. So when we're talking about temperature assessment devices, I mentioned to you before, the rectal temperature is really the only gold standard in the field to do that. Oral temperature, as you see here in the ear, or tympanic, it's known as also oral or RAL in the mouth, temporal across the forehead, or axillary. Those are just not accurate. So the rectal temperature is really the one in the field setting that is recommended. So when we're talking about occupational factors contributing to heat illness, and these things are very, very similar in the athletic populations and for warfighters, these are the things that we tend to see. High temperature and humidity, right? So remember before I said to you about modifying the work to rest ratio based on the environmental conditions. So if it's really hot and humid, we want to have more rest breaks that are longer. Low fluid consumption means someone would be more dehydrated. Direct sun exposure, obviously sun is worse than being in shade or having a lot of cloud cover. Limited air movement, wind can be protective, help your body cooling, more convective cooling. Heavy physical exertion, obviously the intensity of exercise is by far the biggest factor that contributes to your rise in body temperature during activity, so that's a big risk. Poor workplace regulations, meaning for instance, not having fans or not having cooling products, not having hydration accessible, not having heat acclimatization protocols, whatever it is, that could be in that bucket. Bulky protective clothing and equipment, that could be very oppressive. You might be carrying more weight, which causes you to heat up faster, or the clothing and equipment you have on might prevent the dissipation of heat as effective as it would be normally if you just had a t-shirt and shorts on. Individual characteristics, for instance, if people are out of shape, higher percent body fat, if they have a disease like cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, other things, they could change their risk profile. They could be on certain medications or be taking certain supplements. They could have an acute illness at the time. Those are all things that could fall into the bucket of individual characteristics that could change the risk profile. So there's obviously some national regulations that have come out related to this. NIOSH released this document that you can find on the web, recommendations for controlling occupational heat exposure by implementing engineering and work practice controls. It's a good overview produced by our federal government related to things in the occupational setting. This is some OSHA recommendations that are available on site. There's an OSHA app that's out there for telling you your local weather conditions and modifications you should consider based on the heat index. Just an example of another thing that's out there. We released a document in 2017 titled Activity Modification in the Heat, Critical Assessment of Guidelines Across Athletic, Occupational, and Military Settings in the USA. This is a really good overview where the Korey Stringer Institute got together leaders in the US military from NIOSH, from OSHA, and from the NOAA, which is an agency that helps a lot with weather in our country. And these organizations got together and really tried to understand what's the best information we have available right now for athletes, warfighters, and laborers, and how can we share those amongst the different populations, and how can we further our understanding what research still needs to be done. To that end, I want to mention, it's not out yet, but this May or June, we're releasing a really current document from an international consensus statement that was hosted in December about heat safety for laborers. And that will be promoted by First Line. It will be promoted at the Korey Stringer Institute website, and it will be promoted nationally. But that document is coming out very soon, very specific to heat safety issues for the laborer. And the document that I just mentioned that we released in 2017, this gives you just an example of some of the current guidelines that are out by NIOSH and OSHA related to work to rest ratios, work intensity, hydration considerations. I can't go through all of this right now, but it gives you an idea of how in-depth some of these things are. And heat safety managers for different organizations, or the industrial hygienists, or the other people who are taking care of this in a work setting, need to really consider some of these items that are listed here. So when we're talking about specifically activity modification, I notice I have OSHA down, NIOSH, ACGIH. These are different organizations that set some of these standards, whether it be for farmers or oil workers or people who work in factories that are that can get really, really hot. There's literally a myriad of different work settings where people have to work in extreme heat, and these are some resources. And this is an example of wet bulb globe temperature. A lot of times you might be used to the term of heat index. Something that's a little better than heat index is wet bulb globe temperature, because it also takes into account the effect of the sun, or what we call globe temperature, which heat index does not take into account. So the basic thing here is that as the wet bulb globe temperature increases, you should be decreasing the work that you're doing, because your body temperature is going to get hotter. So if you're going to keep people safe, you have to assume they're going to do a little less work. When we're talking about heat acclimatization guidelines, here's 3 different settings: occupational, athletic, and military. And it talks about the really critical, that first 7 to 10 days, and the modifications that we should be doing to keep them safe during that first time. Most of the heat strokes that take place, most of the great risk is in the first 3 to 4 days of heat exposure for people who are not heat acclimatized. So what can we do during that time frame? State policies for heat safety. When in the laborer world, there's very few states, unfortunately, that have really robust safety for workers who work in extreme heat. Some are outdoor worker policies that you see here. But there are a lot of indoor workers who work in oppressive heat. It could be 150 degrees in certain indoor work settings that work in extreme heat conditions. So we're obviously at KSI very interested in trying to advance laborer safety guidelines and policies so that these workers have, different cooling strategies available to them in their work setting, time to use those cooling strategies, hydration available to them, and other just basic guidelines so that they're protected when they're doing their job. And ironically, they'll actually be more productive. So sometimes even the smallest mitigation strategies with relatively small costs will actually increase the productivity for the worker. So that's an irony. It's interesting, this statement here: U.S. Environmental Protection Agency projects that over 1.8 billion labor hours will be lost in the year 2100 to the effects of extreme heat, costing an estimated 170 billion in wages. Could you even imagine? That's just from heat. And now that is obviously speculating some years ahead, but it's obviously a combination of the effects of climate change that are not going to be going away and are rapidly becoming more of an issue. But obviously, and the more and more population also has a big effect, and then just more people laboring outside. So when we're talking about prevention, this is kind of just looping some of that stuff back that I mentioned before: making activity modifications based on the environment, implementing heat acclimatization strategies, having proper hydration before and during activity, and really making sure it's accessible. And very importantly, having body cooling strategies. So during breaks, are there body cooling strategies they can use? Are there devices that are available? Is there shade available? Is there ice available? Are there coolers? Are there other products that they can utilize to keep their body temperature down? Some of those include dousing, cooling vests, ice towels, cold water immersion. This is just an example of some of the things that are really simple based in some work settings. This is more complex than you need to worry about, but it gives you an idea of some of the cooling strategies on the left side. And pre-cooling, per-cooling is during, post-cooling is after. And it gives you an idea of the feasibility and the efficacy of those different items. And this is just a more robust of some of the different things that have been looked at through research through time of different cooling modalities. Body cooling and performance. Some interesting articles that come out. Stevens 2017 found 3 to 9% improvement in time trial times when people actually utilized cooling intermittently during activity. So employers can look at that and think about, if you employ hundreds of people, and you might have a 5% improvement by doing tiny little strategy changes. And then you notice time to exhaustion is dramatically improved and increased when you have cooling strategies. So how can we protect them? I mentioned to you before the Inter-Association Consensus Statement. That was the document from December that I mentioned that's coming out this spring. We're super excited. First Line will share that with you as well, and hopefully that PDF will be available to you within a few months. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. We'll be glad to answer questions after Mike's done presenting, and really thankful for the opportunity to interact with you today. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Casa, for your talk, and thank you to the First Line team for allowing us to present on our results from the study that we did using their ICE device. Title of the study is Impact of Emergent Cooling Equipment on Exercise Performance in the Heat. And this was conducted by Dr. Casa, myself, and as well as our colleague, Erica Philp. So kind of looking at some of the research background. So maintaining a lower body temperature during exercise has been linked to better exercise performance. So ranging from physical improvements, so having more physical capacity to do whichever type of exercise that they're going to be doing, as well as health benefits. So decreasing the risk of different heat illnesses, like Dr. Casa talked about, your heat syncope, muscle cramping, and exertional heat stroke. And so by using cool water on the skin, it can hypothetically decrease the skin temperature, which increases the temperature gradient between the core and the skin, so allowing the body to dissipate heat more efficiently. Increasing cooling potential can also aid in performance as well. So moving on to our research questions and objectives for this study. So does using the immersion cooling equipment affect the thermoregulatory and cardiovascular function during exercise in the heat? Does it affect the subject's perceptual responses during exercise in the heat? So ask them questions, how hard are you working? How hot or cold do you feel? How fatigued are you? Things like that. And then lastly, so does the ICE device affect the athlete's exercise performance when used during exercise? So those are the questions that we were attempting to address in this study. So our hypothesis, so with the ICE device, we will see improvements in thermoregulatory and cardiovascular function during exercise in the heat. Using the ICE device will lead to lower perceptual responses that will occur during forearm cooling versus the control group or no cooling, so our passive cooling group, and I'll dive into that once we get to our methods. And then lastly, by using the ICE device, it'll provide a benefit to exercise performance in comparison to passive cooling, so that seated rest that I mentioned. So right here, we just have a couple figures just looking at the methods for the cooling trials versus the non-cooling trials. So essentially what our subjects did, they came in, we assessed them to make sure that they were hydrated. They self-inserted a rectal thermometer. Then we inserted an esophageal thermometer. So that way we have two valid devices to assess their core body temperature. After they got all wired up, we took them into the chamber, and they started off with 20 minutes of exercise, and we used a protocol that mimics a soccer match. So, during that 20 minutes, they could be walking, sprinting, jogging, things like that, in different intervals. After they got finished that first exercise bout, they did 3 minutes of cooling, and they would repeat that 3 times. So again, the 20 minutes of exercise followed by 3 minutes of cooling. Then we would take a halftime break. So after their third exercise bout, they'd cool and then sit for 20 minutes to mimic a halftime, like they would in a game. Following that, they would do 3 more exercise bouts, followed by 3 minutes of cooling. And with the no cooling trials, it's essentially the same thing, except during their 3 minutes of rest, they were just seated. They were not using the cooling device. And so here we have just a couple pictures from our lab. If anybody's concerned, our subject did provide written consent that we could take photos of him. So this first picture here, just showing him running on the treadmill with Erica asking some perceptual questions regarding how hard he's working. And then the following photo is the subject using the ICE device. Then moving on to our performance test. So once they got done all 6 bouts of exercise, we put them through a battery of tests to assess different factors associated with performance. So we assessed agility using fast feet and double leg hop on what's called the quick board. We also measured power by having the subjects perform a broad jump. We assessed muscular strength using a handheld dynamometer, so assessing grip strength. We also assess by measuring sprints on a non-motorized treadmill. And then the last thing we did with them was look at their aerobic power capacity by having them do a 1 mile time trial. So looking at some of our results here, this is just demographic information regarding our subjects. So as you can see down here in the VO2 max row, our subjects, the average VO2 max was 57.2. So our subjects were very, very fit. If you're not familiar with these values, typically anything over 50 means that you're a very, very fit individual. Additionally, the VVO2, so that's just the max speed that they were on when they hit their VO2 max, was almost 15 kilometers an hour. So, again, very, very fit individuals. And mentioning back to the method, so in that exercise bouts that they were doing with that software that kind of mimicked the soccer match, we entered in their VO2 max data, so that way each subject was running at a capacity relative to their own fitness. And these subjects were working extremely hard during the study, and we can't thank them enough for volunteering their time for us. So moving on to some of our thermal results from the exercise bouts. So as you can see here in this figure on the left, this is the at the end of each bout, we measured their rectal temperature. And unfortunately, we didn't find any statistically significant differences, but there is a trend indicating that those who did not use the cooling were exercising at a higher temperature than those who utilized cooling. And that's even more expressed over here when we look at the esophageal temperature figure. And we did find statistically significant differences between our groups, indicating that the group that received the cooling did have a lower temperature measured by esophageal thermometry. Looking at some of the subjective or perceptual responses. Again, with the RPE, didn't really find any statistical significant differences, but there was still that trend, later on in the bouts that the individuals not using cooling were exerting themselves a little harder than those who did use the cooling. Similar with fatigue, again, no statistical significant differences. But you still can see this trend to where the cooling device allowed them to exercise at a lower fatigue. Now moving down to the bottom left corner, this is our thirst sensation. So here we did get a statistically significant difference. And as you can see here, indicated by the asterisks, that the individuals using the ICE device were less thirsty throughout their trials. Their exercise bouts. And I'll dive into the reason behind that in a little bit. And then lastly, we have the end of exercise bout for their thermal sensation, so how hot or cold they were feeling. Unfortunately, we didn't find any statistically significant differences with this, but again, it's still trending in that direction to where the individuals utilizing the forearm cooling device did feel a lot cooler than those who did not use it. And now moving on to our sweat rates. So this kind of goes along the lines of what I mentioned regarding their thirst. So as you can see on the figure on the left, so their total sweat loss between trials, it was significantly less when individuals utilized the forearm cooling device versus those who did not use the forearm cooling device. And then as you can see, the sweat rate, so just essentially we're normalizing their total sweat loss for the amount of time that they were exercising. And again, we did find a statistically significant difference here. The individuals utilizing the forearm cooling sweat less than those who did not. And this relates back to the thirst and then the core body temperature difference that we saw via the esophageal thermometry, right? So because they had a lower core body temperature, they didn't need to utilize the evaporative effects of sweating. So their body was able to more efficiently, dissipate the heat during their exercise. And now moving on to our performance results. So looking at the agility aspect first, unfortunately, we didn't see any statistical significance or statistically significant differences between the groups. But again, at least in respects to the double leg hop, the cooling group did perform a little better, but again, not statistically significant. And then same thing with the double leg hop errors. The non-cooling group did have some more errors than the cooling group, but again, not statistically significant. However, it was trending in the positive direction. Moving on to the broad jump and grip strength. So the broad jump, unfortunately, was pretty similar between groups, but looking over to the grip strength results, again, the cooling group did perform a lot better than the non-cooling group, which might indicate that the ICE device kind of helps preserve neuromuscular control and fatigue, allowing them to perform better in this grip strength test than those who did not use the forearm cooling device. Looking at our aerobic tests, so again, utilizing the non-motorized treadmill. So what subjects did with this, they sprinted for 6 seconds, and we just count the revolutions of the treadmill. And again, unfortunately, we didn't see any statistically significant differences in respects to the number of revolutions, but still, the cooling group did, on average, perform a little bit better than the non-cooling group. And then looking at the sprint max heart rate, again, no statistically significant differences, but it's still trending in that direction where you can see the no cooling group had a higher heart rate than those who did not use the than those who did use the cooling device. And then looking at some of the perceptual results prior to them starting their mile time trial. So we did find a statistically significant difference between the thermal sensation. So those who utilized the forearm cooling device had a lower thermal perception than those who did not use the cooling device. And then same thing down below here in this last row with fatigue. So those using the forearm cooling device felt less fatigued prior to their mile time trial compared to those who did not use the cooling device. All right, so then kind of breaking the mile time trial down a little bit. So as we can see in the figure on the left here, the subjects that, or the group that did use the forearm cooling device performed statistically significantly better in the 1 mile time trial. So they were able to run that mile faster than when they did not use the forearm cooling device. And then looking at their max temperature that they hit during the mile time, unfortunately, no statistically significant differences here, but again, we still see that trend where those who did not use the cooling device did end at a hotter temperature than those who did use the cooling device. So kind of breaking this all down into our discussion. So our results do suggest that intermittent forearm cooling may be beneficial in lowering body temperature measured via esophageal thermometry while exercising in the heat. Our total sweat loss and total sweat rate were lower when using intermittent forearm cooling while exercising in the heat. And again, this relates back to that decrease in core body temperature, right, via the esophageal thermometry. So the subjects, they didn't have to, again, utilize the evaporative effects of sweating. They were able to sweat less, leading to, lesser risk of dehydration and things like that. And because, the forearm cooling decreases the temperature on the skin, the body is able to dissipate heat a little more efficiently via the conductance of the cold water on the skin. So the use of intermittent forearm cooling during fatiguing bouts of exercise improved post-exercise grip strength and anaerobic endurance. So that 1 mile time trial, right? So the subjects that utilized the ICE device were able to have a stronger grip strength compared to them not using the forearm cooling device, and as well they were able to perform better on their mile time trial. And we also saw the reduction in thermal sensation and fatigued prior to the starting of the mile time trial. So all in all, the forearm ice device, does seem to reduce core body temperature via esophageal thermometry. By using the forearm cooling device, again, it's able to allow the body to not focus solely on the evaporative purposes of sweat. Because it's decreasing the skin temperature around the forearms, it's able to utilize that convection and conduction cooling methods to dissipate heat, so a lesser risk of dehydration, as well as lowering, the thirst sensation and, the thermal and fatigue perceptions during exercise. And that's all I have for you guys today. I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have. And thank you to First Line for having us here today.
Thank you very much, Mike. Third time I've said it now. Thank you very much, Dr. Casa, and thanks for the athletes who volunteered their time and sweat and energy to do this study. I have a few general questions. One would be about basically kind of your thoughts about how or if this could be practically used in a sports practice or game.
I can start out, Mike, if you're okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's huge application in sports, actually, maybe even more so than the commonly used and initial applications in the military, in that any sports that have natural built-in breaks, it's a super easy modality to cool people. Like, so for instance, football offense and defense, when one is off the field, it's an easy way to cool during practices and even during games or conditioning sessions. Even soccer players during halftime, immediately pre-game could use it. Certainly like lacrosse, where they're rotating in and out constantly. So any kind of team sports like that, there's huge application. It could be used universally, like in conditioning sessions in the heat and practice sessions, but it's an extremely convenient modality during a lot of team sport environments where there's a flow on and off the field. And even in soccer, where there's no flow on and off, you could certainly use it at halftime, where we're always looking for modalities to cool them off during halftime and immediately pre-game.
Thanks for that. Another kind of, I'll paraphrase here, but basically thoughts about using forearm cooling or this method of cooling as a pre-cooling before you actually start activity. Any thoughts on the efficacy of that, or if that would be worthwhile?
Mike, you want to start on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'd definitely say it would have some efficacy for sure. I mean, with the pre-cooling, you would have more time before the practice starts to cool. I mean, with this study, the subjects were only cooling for 3 minutes. So kind of just reiterating what Dr. Casa said, it's very applicable, between bouts of, during practice and during water breaks and things like that. But yeah, if if the athletes were to use this prior to exercise or prior to the start of, the practice or activity, they can definitely dunk their forearms in there for 5-10 minutes before practice, right? And hopefully we would see some some mitigation in the heat stress during activity in the hot days.
And also, I'm thinking and pre-cooling before events, because when teams like soccer players and football players do warm-ups before games, they often will warm up for like 20-30 minutes in extreme heat, and their temperatures are sometimes already 102 when the game starts. And also it's cumbersome to cool with other modalities pre-game because they already have their uniform on, equipment on, and logistically it's just very difficult to use, like, for instance, cold water immersion. It's going to be really tough right before a game. So this kind of modality is super simple to do, and it could be on a sideline or even in a locker room, wherever people are right before the event starts. And as Mike was pointing out, it makes a great point that our study showed efficacy, and it was only 3 minutes of cooling, about 3 minutes cooling at different times. To me, like lacrosse and American football are like two of the sports that immediately come to mind in game, where you have these brief moments of time where you could use that cooling modality on the sideline during an event.
Awesome, thank you. And then, another question, this is actually from me, more of a discussion point. Mike, we had discussed that, in fact, one of the participants in the mile in the non-cooling group was unable to finish the mile. Could you kind of give some more detail to some of the people watching about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in one of our subjects' control days, so the day that he did not use the ice device, he got too hot during the mile time, and we had to pull him out of the chamber, to make sure that nothing, he didn't end up developing an exertional heat stroke or anything. So, but then when he did use the ice device, he was able to finish the mile and stayed at a safe temperature. So that kind of just, again, reiterates the point that, this device is showing that, individuals are, able to exercise longer and harder, when using it, at least compared to when they don't.
And I think to reiterate what Mike is saying too, and what we just said on the previous answers, is that a lot of cooling modalities are useful, but some of them are very expensive and some of them are very cumbersome and complicated to set up. The beauty of something like this is that it's very inexpensive, and every sports program we're talking about has access to ice and water. So when you have this relatively inexpensive device that can be used over and over again, and you already have the ice and water, logistically, it's just such a simple product to utilize.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's all for the questions. Dr. Casa, Mike, do you have any final thoughts? All right, so just so folks, if you were unable to make it, or you have a member of your team that was unable to make it, or you want to share this out, we will be sending a link out to all registered users sometime later this week. So just keep an eye on your email for that. And again, I just want to thank you, Dr. Casa, Michael Szymanski, from everybody here at First Line. We really appreciate all the hard work and effort you put into this project. So thank you very much, and have a good week.
I'm glad to assist. If anyone has additional questions, we can always follow up with people later as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, fellas.
Thank you.
See you guys.
All right. Thank you, guys.